A new book of the Torah, Shemot, the book of Exodus, and so it's a new development in the living Parsha. We finished the first of the 5 books of Moses and the transition to a new book. In the Torah text itself, there's actually a gap between the 5 books. So every Parsha has a small little paragraph break. When it comes to the end of an entire book, there's like a 4 or 5 line gap. And so there's empty space between the 2 books. So I think about it, the empty space is kind of giving us space to breathe, because there's a transition between each book has its own character, its own theme, and we need to kind of collect ourselves before we get to the next one. So we're entering into a new stage of this Jewish story. And I think the transition is felt the most between the book of Genesis, Bereshit, and the book of Exodus, Shemot. Genesis is a story of the origin story, beginning of creation, beginning of the patriarchs, the Jewish forefathers before the Jewish nation. It's really a story of individuals and family. Exodus begins the story of a peoplehood, Jewish nationhood, and it's a very obviously a famous story. The Jews are in Egypt, slaves, and then go free from Egypt. We celebrate that at Passover. And that's the next couple of weeks. We discuss that story in detail. And then go on to what happens next. The Jews go to Sinai, receive the Torah, and the rest is history. But from the very beginning, even before they've received the Torah, before they've gone free from Egypt, there's already the undertones of what's to come. So already beginning this process of becoming a people, becoming a nation. And the very fact they were slaves in Egypt was a preparation for their becoming a people. It wasn't by accident. God had foretold to Abraham, your descendants, your children, are going to be slaves in a foreign country. They will go free and become my people. And so the slavery in Egypt was almost a necessary preparation, a prerequisite for them to go into the Torah. So right from the very beginning of the slavery, it's already beginning the planting the seeds of Jewish nationhood and peoplehood. And we're going to explore one specific example of that today. But let's go through the overview of the Parsha. Check if anyone's coming in here. They need it. Okay. All right. So begins with a list of the names of page 320 in the Chumash. And we have the list of the names of Jacob and his children that came down to Egypt. And we learn very quickly that once Joseph dies, the brothers die, suddenly their special status, Joseph we know was the second in command, they lose that status. Pharaoh, quote unquote, forgets Joseph. And there's a debate in the Talmud whether it's actually a new Pharaoh that never had a relationship with Joseph, or the same Pharaoh that conveniently forgot Joseph and his contribution to society, and instead unleashed the oldest hate in the book, the Jewish people. They are a threat to our society. They're their own people, their own culture. They're going to join our enemies. They're growing too fast. They're too successful, not successful enough. He wanted to destroy these people, the Jewish people. And he slowly eases them in to slavery. And so the Midrash tells us that Pharaoh originally proposed a project to be paid for their work. And he himself went down to the work site there's a great, project of Egypt, and then slowly took away their rights, stripped them of their pay, of all their rights, and they became slaves to the state. But he has this vision, Pharaoh, or his ministers have this vision, that it's going to arise a savior. They see in the stars. And so he says all the Jewish children, first the male Jewish children, have to be killed. That way he's going to stop their savior ever coming into the world. Moses, his parents actually, because of this decree against the children, decided they are separating. They didn't want to have kids. They didn't want to live together even. And so they separated. Their daughter, whose name was Miriam, tells them, Pharaoh made a decree on the Jewish male children, the boys. By you separating from each other, You're not allowing any girls to be born either. So you're worse than Pharaoh. She convinced the parents to get back together, and they have a son. Now Moses is born premature, about 2 months premature, or even more. And because of that, the Egyptians were tracking the people's childbirth to know when to come knocking on their door to collect their children. Pharaoh's mother had a couple of months where she was able to hide him at home and take care of him without the Egyptians knowing. But eventually, it came time where they're going to come for him, and so she creates this, engineering miracle, and she creates this basket which is going to float on the Nile and be comfortable for Moses, and she puts the baby in the Nile, hoping for the best, saving his life in the immediate moment, not knowing what will come next. And Miriam's older sister watches to see what happens. What's going to happen with this kid? My young baby brother, what will happen with him? At that exact moment, Pharaoh's daughter, Batya, is going down to bathe in the Nile, and she sees this basket there. And she collects the basket, and there's a child, young baby crying, and she's intrigued. She grabs this child, almost adopts it as her own, but is stuck. How can she just can't nurse this child? How can she feed him? Before they don't have no formula. And so Miriam conveniently pops up and says, "Hey, do you want me to find someone to nurse this child?" She says, "Sure." And so Yocheved, Moshe's mother, ends up nursing her own son and getting paid for it by the princess Batya. And so it's a win-win. But then she has to eventually return Moses to Batya and to the palace. And Moses grows up in Pharaoh's palace. So while his brothers and sisters, his cousins, his family, the Jewish people, are slaves, citizens without any rights, having to work all day under the oppression of the Egyptians, Moses is living a life of privilege in Pharaoh's palace. When he gets of age, he decides he's going to take a walk and wander around the country, see what's going on outside the walls of the palace. And he sees the treatment the Jews are getting. And he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew. And is appalled. And the text says he looked both ways. On page 329, verse 12. He turned this way and that way, and he perceived that no one was looking, and he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. So he looks around, makes sure not being caught on a simple level, and he kills this Egyptian who's harassing this Jew. There's a fascinating interpretation. What does it mean he looked this way and that way? So Rashi says he looked into the future of this Egyptian and saw no good would come out of him in his descendants. Strange interpretation because, well, if you're going to kill him, there won't be descendants. So what does it mean? How can there be a potential for descendants but not actual? But there's another interpretation I once learned, I think is very beautiful. Moses at that moment had an identity crisis. Am I a Jew? These are my brothers. I know I'm part of this family, these people. But I grew up in the palace. I'm Egyptian. I don't need to be suffering.
He doesn't know for a fact yet that he's Jewish. He feels it, but he doesn't.
He may know. We don't know if he knows or not.
Would he have been circumcised?
He was, according to the Midrash, he was born circumcised, born with a circumcision. But yes, he would have been circumcised.
But okay. I mean, they would have been if his mom was hiding him, then they could have had a covert. It would have been.
It would have been a circumcision, yes.
Some covert. Okay.
So he may have known. We don't know how he knows, but I'm assuming he knew. He knew he wasn't from a natural born into Batya's family, adopted. So he has this identity crisis. Who do I side with? My blood or my natural people who I feel a kinship with, the Egyptians? And he looked this way and that way is kind of a metaphor. He looked to this side of the fence and to that side of the fence, and he saw that there was no one there, which means he saw he had no identity. He can't be in both worlds. He has to pick a side. He has to be somewhere.
Why isn't it just a plain, that he's looking to see if anyone's there? Because it kind of feeds into the next part. He's clearly nervous about being seen, and then the next thing realizes that it's actually known. I just read that as tying into the concept of whether or not he was observed or not.
Yes, the simple reading is that he looked both ways, so no one was watching. That's a simple reading.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, Rashi isn't satisfied. Usually Rashi appreciates the simple reading of the verse.
Right.
And here he does not. It may be the wording koi vakoi here and here. It's a strange wording. It may be, how did he know one was there if there were people there watching? I don't know exactly why he's unsatisfied with the simple reading. But I thought there's a nice commentary that says, in this moment when Moses really grounds himself as a Jew, right, and takes action, defends his brother by killing this Egyptian in self-defense. But as we see in the next verse, he was found out. There were a couple people that saw him do this, Jews, that ended up dubbing him in to Pharaoh. And now Moses is a wanted man. Despite being a prince, despite being up in Pharaoh's house, he is a wanted man. He has to escape Egypt. We don't know exactly how old he is now. We assume late teens, 20. He's coming of age to discover himself. So he's around 20, let's say. Young man. And he has to escape Egypt. The next we hear from him is much older. So there's a whole gap in Moses' life right here. The next thing we learn, he goes to Midian. I'll get to that in a second. But we do know he gets married, has a kid, then experiences God at the burning bush. He's 80 years old then. So from 20 till 80, where was Moses? We don't know. There's a fantastic midrash which speaks about him becoming a king in Ethiopia for 40 years and leading the country there. There's a big gap in Moses' life, his formative years as a young adult, where he's missing. But the next thing we do learn about him is he goes to Midian. And he decides, what do Jews do when they come to a foreign place and looking to settle down and find someone to marry? Where's the Jewish dating scene? The well. That's what his ancestors did, right? So he goes to the well of Midian. Now, simply on the town square, right? The well that everyone gathered to get water. That's where people just hung out. The watering hole. Today would be the bar, and then it was the well. So he goes to the well and he sees these group of girls. They're Yisro's daughters. Yisro was a very celebrated man in Midian. He was the priest, but then he had, apparently the Midrash says, he had sort of rejected the pagan worship there and became a persona non grata. He wasn't no longer wanted, to the point where his daughters had to be the ones getting the water, which is unusual. And he helps them get water. They're being harassed. These girls are being harassed by the shepherds and discriminated against, and he helps them get the water. And they go home, and their father's like, "Hey, how'd you come home so fast today? Usually they don't give you any treatment there, make you go last." He said, "Well, this wonderful, friendly Jew."
It says Egyptian man.
Egyptian man, sorry, yes, Egyptian man. Actually, the Zohar is something interesting where Moses was described as Egyptian and didn't correct the record and was punished for that. So he didn't sort of embrace his identity at that moment. Yes. So this wonderful person, Egyptian man, came to help us out. And so Yisro says he didn't bring him home. Right? Now, Rashi says something interesting. He says Yisro knew history very well. And he says if the war is coming to greet him, if he's having this miraculous experience of the well, he must be a Jew. And therefore, I want him to marry one of you.
But what it says that just reading commentary, knew that the water descended out of the well for Jacob and Rachel. I don't remember that as a thing. That the water ascended out of the well for Jacob and Rachel on its own volition. Is that
yes. Hi, how are you? No, come in. We're just going to an overview of the Parsha.
And Rabbi, why did
Yes.
Moshe leave Egypt? Did I miss hearing that?
Yes, he had protected a Jew and killed an Egyptian, and therefore he was a wanted man in Egypt.
Thank you.
He was afraid for his life and he escaped. He fled the country. Yes, so the story goes there when Jacob goes to the well there, and they had a hard time getting water, taking the rock off. He took the rock off, and the water rose towards him.
That's like a midrash.
Yeah. So Yisro says to his daughters, "Why don't you bring him home?" So they go back to the well. They find him and they bring him home. We're on page 330. And so he ends up marrying Yisro's daughter, Tzipporah. And they have a child, and he calls the child Gershom. Very interestingly, he says, I am a stranger in a strange land. So Moses does not feel at home in Midian. He knows it's not his place. Where is his place?
What page are we on?
Page 330. 330. Right, so where is Moses' place? We know that, Joseph would have felt a stranger in Egypt because he belonged in Israel. That's where his family was. Moses almost had no place. He didn't grow up with the Jews. The palace, he knew he didn't belong there. But yet, in Midian, he definitely felt, I'm in a strange place. So he felt he belonged somewhere and not here. Right? And he became a shepherd for his father-in-law Yisro. And so now he's shepherding the flock. And one day he goes out with the sheep to the future site of Mount Sinai, Horeb. And in this place, he sees this wonderful vision, or he sees this thing in front of him of the burning bush. And there's this thorn bush that is being on fire, but not being consumed. And he turns around like, what is going on here? Pays attention to it, and he hears God's voice saying, hold on a second, don't come forward, this is a holy space, take off your shoes. He does that, and God says to him, Moses, I am the God of your ancestors, and I have a mission for you. I've heard the cries of the Jewish people, and I need you to go to Egypt to free them. Now, I'll point something out very interesting. When God describes to Moses the cries he heard in Egypt from the Jewish people, there's 4 expressions of their outcry. These are in starts off in verse 7. God said, I have indeed seen the affliction of my people in Egypt. I have heard their outcries, that's 2, and aware of their pains. And verse 9. The outcry of Israelites reached me, seeing the oppression of the Egyptians subjecting them. And so that's how it's in the English. So in the Hebrew, there's definitely 4 different expressions.
I think it starts at 7, maybe. I have indeed seen the affliction of my people. I've heard their outcry caused by chastisement. That's 7. And then 9 is another time.
Even let's go back further. Sorry, on page 331, that's when God hears them, tells Moses. But originally, it says the actual story when the Jews cried out, and verse 23. The Israelites moaned on account of the suffering. They cry out to God, they please, and then in 24, the anguish groaned. And so there's 4 different expressions of their suffering, and what those different things are, I can't tell exactly. But it's also interesting that God's response has 4 different characteristics. That God heard, He knew, and He looked upon them. So, in relation to the 4 different experiences of pain they had, God was responding to that. So the Jews have reached a breaking point in Egypt, right at this moment. And that's when God appears to Moses and says, hey, I need you to help the Jewish people. It's been a long time in slavery. They've been there for a while. But for some reason, until then, sort of God had forgotten about them. Yeah.
Wasn't it because a woman that was stirring the clay mortar was giving birth and her kid died while she did that? Isn't that what Dad was talking about, that moment?
That's that moment. Yes, there's different midrash on what's back at that moment. Either that, the child falling with the brick, or Pharaoh had forced them bathing in the blood of the Jewish children, and that. So there's something caused so much anguish. It wasn't just working hard and being slaves, but a breaking point where the Jews just couldn't take it anymore, and that visceral scream and cry is what elicited God's response. It's almost, the Jews didn't have, it wasn't a formal prayer. It wasn't even crying out to God. Just the inner scream from the depths of their soul. That's the most powerful sort of prayer, authentic prayer, and that's what really moved God to take action right now.
It says that Pharaoh died. Is that that's in the plain text?
Yeah.
But it's sort of implied that that a new Pharaoh came out was even worse. Is that, why would it say that?
Which verse are you referring to?
23. This during those many years that the king of Egypt died, these realized moaned on account of this program and cried out. It's just
Yeah, so the Midrash says doesn't mean he died literally. This is one Midrash. This is where he died, meaning he became very sick and needed the blood of the Jewish children to heal. And so the Midrash says that story sparks the real depth of the cry of the Jewish people. That's Midrashic reading.
is there another reading?
There must be. Like, why? Maybe an opportunity.
Or maybe just that there's a new one.
New one could be worse. So maybe now is an opportunity. Hey, there's a shake up in the leadership.
Right.
Now's the moment. So God appears to Moses in the burning bush. And this is a fascinating. We're going to dwell on this in a moment. What this means, this episode, because it's a incredible visualization, and there's a lot of depth and meaning there. But we'll get back to this in a second. He tells Moses, "I want you to go take the Jews out of Egypt." And Moses' initial reaction, like any good leader should be, is no, I can't do this. I'm up to the job. And then finally he says, I have a speech impediment, I can't do this. And then he says, find someone better. According to the Midrash and the Talmud, Moses is debating with God, arguing for 7 days. It's a week. Negotiations, right? And this is, the Jewish people on the line. They're suffering through this. And I was thinking about it this week. Right now, the hostage negotiations going on, and I'm literally refreshing the news every 5 minutes, seeing, is there any update?
I was guilty of that too.
Right? Which doesn't help anyone, but there's so much anguish and pain, and you're hoping that. So this was going through this a week-long negotiation. Moses knew people are suffering, but he wasn't up to the task, and God started pleading with him, getting upset at him. Like, just do this. I know you can do this. And every stage Moses is rejecting it, and God finally says, I'm going to be with you. You will be successful. Your brother Aaron will help you. He'll speak for you, be your spokesperson. You can do this. And eventually Moses agrees. But he says, what if the Jews don't believe me? So God gives him a couple of signs to prove himself to the Jewish people. Little miracles where he can play these tricks on the Jews and say, look, I can prove to you God actually appeared to me. And he says, what if they say that who's this person that sent you? And God there revealed himself, Eryah, this name of God, first time appearing, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. That's how you should present me, the Jewish people.
It's interesting that it talks about him that 3-day journey to the wilderness. The original concept isn't let my people go. The original concept is just let them take a 3-day break in the wilderness.
Yes, that's a very interesting point you bring out. And Moses actually goes to the Pharaoh, says the same thing originally.
Yeah.
Let him take a 3-day break. Let him go have pray to God and come back.
Pharaoh says no paid vacation, basically.
Exactly. Or not even unpaid vacation. No personal time off. Yes, and that's incredible discussion in the commentaries. Why that was it honest? Was that the original plan and something changed? Or was it always just a ploy?
Pretext or scam.
Yeah, and then is that ethical to kind of negotiate with Pharaoh on this false pretense? So it's a very interesting conversation. Why would it need to be this way? Some say that it was originally intended, and then once Pharaoh rejected that, okay, now we're going all out. You don't want this compromise and forget it. We're leaving. Some say, it was just a way of getting Pharaoh to agree, but it was never planned to come back. Interestingly, at the end of the story, when the Jews actually leave Egypt, the Egyptian army catches up with them 7 days later at the Sea of Reeds, where they need to have the splitting of the sea. And so the reason 7 days later is because after 3 days, so the Jews weren't coming back. And then they had to give chase. So there was even, according to some readings, an understanding at the end even, Pharaoh expected to be in 3 days, they got to come back. And they didn't. But it's an interesting thing to notice, yeah. So finally, God convinces Moses to go. And he goes to Egypt, and he convinces the Jews. He gets there, and the Jews first actually won't even listen to him because of his. The Egyptians won't even listen to him. The Jews, they're so broken from the work they're going through. They're exacerbated. They're out of breath, and he won't listen, which is an incredible thing to think about, where someone's coming to save them, they can't even hear the words of salvation. They're so deep in their problem, right? I think we all have that sometimes, where we're so in a problem that we won't even be open to hearing a solution.
It's interesting though, because it talks about their pleas to God, but they're pleading, but then they're not ready. When something actually
Right,
comes.
they're desperate, they're in pain, but they're almost like rejecting any solution. Like, don't bother me, I'm in the middle of stressing out right now. I have a solution for you. No, are you crazy? You're making me crazy. So literally the shortness of breath, which also is indicative of, breath is a way of accessing our self, our soul. And so shortness of breath means they weren't attentive. They weren't able to be present to Moses, but he does eventually get through to them. And he goes to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh laughs at him, says, who sent you here? God. Pharaoh says, I know a lot of gods, they have pagan worship in Egypt. I never heard of this God before. And Moses produces a couple of miracles, and the staff turns to a snake, and he convinces Pharaoh, but Pharaoh is not convinced at all, and instead of making it easier for the Jewish people, he makes it harder for the Jews. He says, you're gonna try to get out of here? You think you have a savior? Forget about it. He made the work even harder for the Jewish people. And the Jews come to Moses and say, well, why did you come here? Just make it more difficult for us? We don't need you. We don't need you to come make life more challenging for us. And the Parsha ends Moses going to Pharaoh, to God, and saying, what did you do to me? Why did you send me here to make it more difficult for Jewish people? I failed before I started. And he's questions is God's sending him there. And next in Parsha is God answering him and sort of encouraging him to go again. And then he goes in to Pharaoh and performs the 10 plagues, and the rest is history, and we can test it next week. That's an overview of the Parsha, a lot to pack in, a wild story. And it's the beginnings of the Jewish story, which makes every detail here have a lot of resonance and a lot of meaning, because the reason the story is told in this detail is to share with us about what our lives are meant to be about, what it means for us. Any questions on the Parsha overview here?
How does he have a brother Aaron if, like, they were killing with his sons
Aaron was born beforehand.
before the edict?
Yeah, Miriam and Aaron were older, and Moses was born after that. Yeah.
Were they all Levi?
Yeah. Their father was a Levi, so their father was a grandson of Levi. So they were all part of the tribe of Levi.
Is a grandson? So we're only 4 generations from.
Essentially, yeah.
Levi had a son Kahas, who had a son Amram, who had a son Moshe. Yeah, we're Moses' 4th generation.
The 7 generations from Abraham to
Yeah.
Moshe, yeah.
Oh, I thought
It's
it was
also
more
the same
than
thing with the Chabad Rebbe, 7 generations.
Yes, the cycle of 7 generations from Noah, from Adam to Noah, 7 generations. From Noah to Abraham, 7 generations. Abraham to Moses, 7
I always
generations.
pictured it like way longer. I guess because the number of people expanded to.
It's around
so many.
210 years, which is around 4 generations.
Right. Okay.
Or depending on how,
Okay.
Moses was 80 years old then, so really he was born after 130 years, right?
And okay, just population growth is so explosive.
Yes, the
Or how many
Midrash,
people we're
that's
talking
a
about?
force of the Midrash to say
Yeah.
that they had like 6 children at a time. That was like miraculous population growth. Went from 70 to about 2 million.
You understand why the Pharaoh was concerned.
Yeah.
Also, on that note too, with Pharaoh's big concern, which I know says, well, the translation of Art Scroll from us, so it's slightly different, but I know in that one it mentions that Pharaoh was concerned about the enemies that the Jews might associate with, which there actually, interestingly, is a people that they suspect are those said enemies, and actually they were known as the Hyksos. They're also from Canaan as well, and it's a little choppy with the details and the timeline, but essentially there was a 100-year period, which 50 of them were when the Hyksos essentially, like, they were merchants who came to Egypt, and they, through political posturing and manipulation, actually took over Egypt, and for 50 years ruled, and then the Egyptians, this is the upper half of Egypt, and then for 50 years after Egypt, the Egyptians had a violent war to expel the Hyksos. So it's suspected that these are the people that basically were the enemies that Pharaoh was worried about. And they were pretty smart people. Supposedly they introduced chariots and compound boats to Egypt.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah, I think it's a trope of like dual loyalty, right?
Yes.
The Jews didn't display any sign of being unfaithful to Egypt, but the fact that they were different, we can't trust you. You may,
That's true.
enemies.
And if these Hyksos
Well, how
were,
much do you think?
that's true, that too. Oh, and I should also
Yeah.
mention too, imagine like these Egyptians who fought the Hyksos to expel them, who I guess also the Hyksos are from Canaan as well, just like the Jews. So they're like, oh, these people from the same
Right, natural allies.
Yeah, and they had this 50-year period of fighting, and I'm sure a lot of military-age men died. So on the one hand, they're saying, oh, look, we can't really reproduce as much as we were before. And now these Jews are having sextuplets. So it's like,
Right, although I think the Midrash says that only they started having this mass amount of children once they became enslaved. It's almost like the challenge itself produced an extra miraculous birth rate, as far as I remember. But I know Pharaoh did in individual arguments against the Jews. Pharaoh did put the high birth rate, I think, as part of it. They're growing and they're becoming very populous. So it was definitely part of his concern. Yeah.
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, also wasn't Yitro also in Pharaoh's courts at one point?
The Midrash says that yes, that Yitro was originally an advisor to Pharaoh. It's not the plain text doesn't make it that connection. Yeah.
Makes sense.
I find it so interesting how on page 335 it says, what kind of God is it that allows the children of these forefathers whom he loved so dearly to suffer in such a terrible exile for so long? Why does it remember us only now that we have suffered so much and thousands upon thousands of children have been slaughtered? It's almost like what happened back then. I feel like history keeps repeating itself somehow. When it was Shoah, and somehow now again. And it's like almost like every generation or second generation has to go through this pain and suffering somehow, where people are always like questioning, why is this happening to us, and where's God, and why is he not saving us from this? It's like back then it was already like foreseeing what's going, and it says somewhere down here further down where he says, I can already see the future sufferings or future where you're going to be in exile and all these things, but I'm not telling them that.
Right.
In that moment.
Yes. And we'll get to that in a moment because that's part of the burning bush sort of vision as well.
Yeah.
But yes, and that's the sort of the one commentary of what Moses asking God, like, what should I tell him your name, like, first name basis, like, what's God's name? But Moses asking God, like, what should I tell them about you? Who's this? You claim to be a messenger from God. If God really cares about us, where was he till now, right? And God tells him, yeah, sure, I will be where I'll be. I'm with you in this darkness of your suffering, the same way I'm with you in the good times. And it's this you said, the Jewish story of being able to recognize God, have faith even in challenging times, that God is present no matter what. But then there is some sort of in history meaning to all the suffering, right? There's growth that comes from that. Not that we rationalize it in any way, the suffering of the Jewish people and definitely the barbaric loss of life, the Holocaust, or more recently October 7th. But for some reason that's our fate, right? And it's a cycle of we've experienced it throughout our history, and there's some purpose to it, right? There's something that challenge we had to go through for whatever reason, that almost like a seed, the kernel has to disintegrate in the ground before it can have growth.
It's almost like to keep reminding the Jewish people what it's all about. And oh, by the way, you're Jewish. You're getting it, especially like Jews that are, let's say, maybe less connected, like less religious or whatever. I feel like especially in the US, there was a lot of Jewish people that were Jewish but not really living very Jewish, right? And all of a sudden it was like this wake up call. It's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm also Jewish, right? Like if I were to be in the same room as an Orthodox person, and even though I'm not Orthodox, they wouldn't care, I would be the same Jewish person for them, right? Almost
Right,
like this,
I'd be hesitant to say that's sort of why it happened. Like that's kind of rationalizing, say God took these people's lives that we should wake up. We can learn the lesson from it. We can have this wake up call, but to rationalize it and explain it that way, I think is taking it too far. And I think, and I'll share in a moment, that may even be part of what God was telling Moses in the burning bush. Don't rationalize the suffering. So even if there is purpose to it, It's not our job to explain it.
It's interesting how it doesn't seem to happen in that same way to other groups of people.
So I think in a way you're right, 100%. Our history, our fate is different. Other groups of people, and when they face that challenge and that end up disappearing, right? Empires fell and were gone. They also had death and wars, but they just then faded to history. We have these tragic moments in our history, and we bounce back. We're able to maintain our composure. We're able to strengthen our faith and grow from that. So everyone has had, I think, this. We've had it more, obviously, and Jews are a natural target for whatever reason. The hate against Jews has been commonplace and a steady feature of history. But the bigger sort of novelty is not the fact that we've suffered, the fact that it hasn't broken us.
The exodus from the suffering, that too.
Right.
That's like the whole thing is. Remember, like, there's like this thing that Jordan Peterson did with like a bunch of his like colleagues, but like the best guy on that panel was Dennis Prager on Exodus specifically. And that exact topic came up, which is like the glorifying of like suffering as like a justification for future good. Like there's some kind of blood meter that the Shemot like filled up to the top, and then now Mashiach can finally come, kind of thing. Because like now it's just like a Christian view of it. Like we're all about Exodus.
Yeah, we definitely want to focus on that and like, oh, there's a reason why this happened. And there's an interesting I forgot the details of it, but there was a Hasidic Rebbe that lost his whole family in the Holocaust, his whole life. He had many children, and he survived. He moved to Israel, and he rebuilt. He was very instrumental in Netanya, built a hospital there, and he once shared that he had a sort of a vision, a dream. He was the Kalav Rebbe, and he did have a beard because his hair was pulled out by the Nazis, and he was a very, very special person. And he once, I think I heard it in his name, and shared that he had sort of this dream, and God came to him. I can explain to you, you've done so much good. I can explain to you why it happened. I can explain to you why it had to happen, or you can be given the secret. And he said, I don't want it, because to understand why it happens is to cease to be human. You no longer have sympathy. You lose your sensitivity.
He only died like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, he lived,
recently. Wow.
Yeah, lived for a while. And so, almost to understand, there is some deep secrets of creation why God wants these things to happen. But to me, to understand it is to rationalize it, is to desensitize myself to it. But I'm meant to understand it. So our job is to move forward, not to ask why it happened, but what I can do now about it. That's really our job.
Which is interesting because on the other side, there's constantly this, they keep saying why it happened. Their reasoning is because the Jews took away our land 75 years ago, right? So they're like rationalizing this whole thing somehow, which is not what we're supposed to do, what you're telling me.
Right. Why it happened is not our job. It's not helpful. Meaning it's helpful in the sense if you can change something, but it's not helpful to like blame things. So, any other questions here? Okay. So I want to go back to the burning bush. It's a fascinating episode because we've had God appear to people before throughout Genesis, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. God has made appearances. He's spoken to them. There was never this fanfare, no great spectacle. And here, when God appears to Moses for the first time, instead of just knocking on his door and saying, "Hey, Moses," right? Appearing to Moses. Or in a dream, like he came to Jacob in a dream. Here, this is like, almost like God got a new PR firm, and like, here, burning bush, that's gonna get Moses' attention. Why the need for that? Why couldn't just God speak to him like everyone else?
I guess this was a bigger mission than what he had before.
Okay, but still, bigger mission, but then a face-to-face conversation with God is pretty serious, right?
Well, there was there was a more of a continuity in the conversation in the previous generations. It was one family. It was starting with Abraham. It was something that,
But even the first time he appeared to Abraham, there wasn't any special. It was God appeared to Abraham.
right, there's a break here, and he's living his whole life without anything like that. Abraham, even before that, had a calling. He left. God told him to leave. And even before he was already having a conversation with God before that. But for this is sort of like someone who really was more of a wake up for someone who wasn't living a life necessarily aligned to that at all.
Okay, that's one definitely a good line of thinking, and I'll say something interesting. Why was Moses chosen to be the leader of the Jews?
Regular guy.
Okay, explain.
Like he was coming from two randoms, like just like two regular people. And like I think that's like what it was called for, like to send a signal to everyone that like if I can be this leader, then like we all have what it takes to lead this exile.
Okay, so he was a regular guy, but I'll challenge that. He wasn't a regular guy. Right, the average Jew going through Egypt lived a certain lifestyle. They lived part of the Jewish camp, were slaves. This is hundreds of years. So really, the culture was entrenched in these people. Right, think of 200 years. Right, since the beginning of the 1800s till now. That's how long the Jewish people were living there, and they had lived through this slavery and this oppression. Moses didn't have that experience. From a baby, he grew up in a privileged place in the palace, in the house of the oppressor, right? He was an outsider. He was someone, you can imagine the Jews would have not identified with him at all, right? You don't know our struggles. You didn't grow up with this.
And not just that, also, the Jews probably would have saw like, oh, you're this spoiled kid who's living right next to our oppressor. So clearly was an outsider to both the Egyptians and the Jews as well.
Right. Or they may not even known about it. Like there wasn't much interaction. There were different classes of society. They were living in different places. He really wasn't one of them. For all intents and purposes.
Maybe because he also just didn't, because he was never a slave, he maybe just didn't carry that like heaviness in his heart, right? Like he first lived a privileged life, then he lived a simple life, but he never experienced slavery, and I guess didn't have that anger, hate, whatever you want to call it, in him.
Nice. Okay. So almost like someone who's gone through slavery, especially born into generations of it, is so deep in it, almost can't think beyond it.
Yeah.
Stockholm syndrome, right?
Mhm.
You're so a part of it, you cannot even imagine a life that's bigger than this. It took someone who didn't grow up in it to say, guys, there's a reality outside of this. There's a possibility of escaping Egypt. It wasn't just you could take a Jew out of the practical slavery, but the mindset was so entrenched in them. They needed someone who didn't grow up in slavery to be able to show them this, which is almost the first interaction Moses had when it comes to the Jews. They can't listen to him because of their shortness of breath, meaning they're so entrenched to imagine a shift in society so radical. They were born in, he was speaking to, their grandparents were slaves, right? Their parents were slaves. You come to them and say, hey, God has sent me to free you. It's such a far-fetched possibility. This is our fate. Of course, they were cried out and they were in pain, but they could probably never even imagine it actually changing. It took someone who didn't grow up there to say, there is a possibility. Like, I can show you this. And there's a clash of Moses saw it, they didn't see it because he had to show it to him. He had to guide him there. That's one idea. There's another interesting commentary that says, anyone who's too familiar can never be a leader. A leader has to have a certain distance. For me to respect you, if we're buddies, I can look up to you. I never really respect you as a leader. We're friends, I know you. If Moses would have grown up, or anyone grew up in the Jewish people, and someone comes and says, oh, God spoke to me, I'm going to lead you. Who are you, right? Find me a leader who's going to be elected that 100% of the population votes for him. It's impossible. There will be 50% that like you, if you don't like it. No one's ever going to say, we have ultimate respect for you. You're one of us. And I can argue with you, and I can disagree with you. I'll never take you for anything more than me. It had to be someone who wasn't one of them that I can say, I am God's messenger, and they will respect that you're different to us. And therefore, because he didn't grow up in that milieu, he didn't grow up with the Jewish people, he was able to command a certain respect that no one else was able to. Those are practical suggestions. But I think there's something else here as well. Yeah.
Didn't Miriam also foresee that her parents will have a special child and he will be the rescuer of the Jewish people? I don't, maybe she didn't know that he was going to rescue, but she knew that he was going to be that they will have a special child.
Right, she was a prophetess. There was some sort of foresight she had, yes. And she gets credit for that, for bringing Moses into the world, visiting her parents, taking care of him. She does get credit for that later on in life. Yes. So I want to. We don't have a lot of time left. I want to two interesting ideas where Moses came from and why the burning bush was sort of the combination of that. One is on the sort of the ethical side. One's on the more spiritual side. Moses, the series of events that led up to the burning bush being chosen. There are two in the text, one in the Midrash, that show his ethical sensitivity, standing up for the vulnerable population. Right? First of all, he sees a Jew being harassed by an Egyptian, makes a very difficult choice, put his life, reputation on the line to protect that Jew. He could have walked by. The Egyptian had all the power in the world. He stood up to the powerful on the sake of the powerless, and he risked his own life. Right? For a Jew who didn't know, he didn't necessarily feel that essential kinship with automatically, and he stood up for him because it was the right thing to do. The next episode in Midian, he goes there, and these strangers, these girls, who again he sees are being harassed. Their life is at stake, but they're being treated disrespectfully. They're being discriminated against. And a stranger in a strange place, he's new to town, takes a stand, protects them, helps them out, and puts himself against the people of Midian. So again, we find Moses standing up for the oppressed, for the people. Doesn't need to. No one will hold it against him. But he puts himself out there on the line for the sake of those girls who were suffering.
Well, which section is that? That's
page 330, verse 17. Well, the 16 says the girls came down to the well.
I see.
The shepherds came and drove them away. Moses arose and rescued them and
I
ordered
see.
their flocks.
I see.
So he protected them. And then the third story, the Midrash tells a story. How did Moses end up over there by Sinai, where he saw the burning bush? He was tending to Yisro's flock, and one sheep strayed away. And the Midrash says for a few days, Moses was chasing after this one stray sheep who needed water and to help that sheep out. And God said, this is the Midrash says, God says, I see how much care and concern he has for one individual sheep. That's the kind of leader I want for the Jewish people, who's going to care for every individual. And so again, here he shows his concern for an individual. He has a whole flock, so one sheep's gone. You know, out of your, you put on your the bottom line of the end of your accounts. At the end of the day, one sheep less. Not gonna make a big difference. But for that one sheep, it's the entire world. And so for days he's chasing sheep. Where does he end up? At Mount Sinai, where the burning bush was. And so here the Midrash introduces a third episode. Moses cared for this individual sheep. This sort of ethical pattern that Moses displayed is what made God choose him for a leader. And that is the symbolism, one reading of the burning bush. You have a very low thorn bush, representing sort of the lowest kind of person. It's not a fruit-producing tree. It hurts you, right? The thorns. And that's sort of representative of a person that has no value to add. It's a person that's thorny, that's uncomfortable. But even that individual, there's a passion of fire burning, right? There's something alive there. God's presence is burning in them. And that was the message God was telling Moses, that you've sort of experienced this, that's why I'm choosing you. That's the God that you've seen. That burning passion, that fire, that meaning, that purpose, that value you see even in the thorn. And so God was sharing that with him as he prayed.
Was there maybe also one reason, I'm not sure, that when Moses killed the Egyptian because he saw that he mistreated the Jewish slave, that I don't know if Moses realized in the moment, but maybe he did, that he pretty much in that moment gave up his his pampered lifestyle to go and live this very simple lifestyle. And most people who live a good lifestyle don't want to walk away from that to go live a simple lifestyle. So he was willing to give that up. So maybe that was also okay.
He didn't know though. He thought no one was watching, right? He was surprised the next day he found out and he was caught. He thought no one saw it. He didn't expect to be found out. He may have known the risk though. You're right, he may have known the risk. But he definitely didn't expect to face any consequence of that.
It's an interesting question though. He says Because he does look before he strikes. So then what
if someone was there, right? What would he have done?
He should have walked by, right? I haven't thought about that.
Should have just had trust in Hashem, because he had to look. That's kind of like when it comes down to it, like when they were leaving Sodom, like don't look back, and then he looked back.
Right. So that good point, and that may be addressing your question. Jordan asked before.
Right.
The simple reading is he looked both ways. Why is Rashi unsatisfied and
Maybe
says
that's why.
he looked to the history, to the future? What's wrong with the simple reading here? And maybe that's what. The simple reading implies Moses wouldn't have done what he did if someone was watching. And perhaps we're uncomfortable with that. And we think, no, he would have done it anyways. He wasn't looking to see them watching. He was looking to see if any good would come from this Egyptian in the future that should stop him from killing him. So that's interesting.
I always like the
Comes a full circle.
readings.
Right, yeah. So another interesting reading, and there's a lot to say, the burning bush is a lot of ink has been spilled exploring it. And a lot of there's a lot of ways to understand the thorn, why it's not getting consumed, and what it means to Moses. But the word burning bush, the word bush here is a very unique word. It's only times used in Torah. The Hebrew word is sneh. Samach nun hey sneh. We don't know exactly the meaning. Some kind of thorn bush, right? A very similar word is Sinai. And there's a link here between the bush and the eventual mountain, which was the same place, but the name of the mountain, Sinai. So God was kind of telling Moses, this vision you're having here is a precursor to the vision all the Jewish people will have at Mount Sinai. What was unique about Mount Sinai, the Jewish people becoming a nation? What's the foundation of the Jewish project? It's that Judaism is at once this very spiritual, transcendent religion with a very practical aim. All the mitzvahs are helping us live a very embodied spiritual life, right? We're not about escaping the world. We're not either about just being very materialistic. It's about marrying the spiritual pursuit with a very material anchor, right? And that's really the entire Jewish project. That's what happened at Sinai. Abraham kept Torah also. He never actually integrated it into his lifestyle. It wasn't a mitzvah from God to live this lifestyle. And so the integration of spirituality into the physical life we live was what really happened at Sinai. And God was telling Moses at that moment this thing. Moses escaped the fate of the Jewish people. He spent years wandering the world. And one sort of way of looking at Moses came to the burning bush. What was he doing there? Why was he at this mountain? And one of the commentaries, the foreigner says, he knew this mountain had special history associated with it, of holiness. And he wanted to have this sort of spiritual experience. He came for a spiritual high to meditate on this mountain. He was looking for escape. Moses spent his days meditating and he was looking for the spiritual escape. He ended up on this special mountain. And the reason the burning bush caught his eye and surprised him is because fire, which is often a symbol for spirituality, fire is sort of the most spiritual physical existence. It's always ascending. It has no weight. It's something which is always a metaphor used for God's presence and for spiritual growth. And here's a fire which is anchored in a tree. It's not escaping. It refuses to be consumed. Usually fire consumes whatever material it can get its hands on and destroy it until it runs out of fuel. Here, the fire was not consuming the tree. And that sort of was a metaphor telling Moses, if you want to have this sort of fire to a spiritual experience, you don't have to escape. You can do it in a way that's embodied in the material, in the tree, in the lowest thorn tree. And that vision was telling Moses to realign himself. And that's also the whole debate between Moses and God. Moses, I don't want to become a leader. Why not? Being a leader takes a lot of work. If you're a spiritual person, I don't want to deal with people's problems. I don't want people knocking on my door asking me for advice. I don't want to have to go to Pharaoh. I want to live my simple, pure life where I can remain connected to my own purpose, remain in touch with whatever meditative practice I do. I want to live in the mountaintop. And God says, no, you have a mission. There's a cause here that needs you. And Moses says, no, I want to remain connected spiritually. And God was really telling him, and it took a week to convince him, the two don't need to be mutually exclusive. Sometimes the greatest spiritual achievement is helping another person, giving them food to eat. That is your spiritual achievement. It's not, you don't have to disconnect yourself from whatever spiritual path you're on. That is an embodiment of the spiritual path.
And the analogy to the bush is the concept that the inspiration and spirituality it doesn't consume. I'm just trying to work through the analogy.
Doesn't consume the material. Doesn't say there's no space for material here. Material can remain, and there still be the fire. It's not consuming it. It's not overpowering it. It's not
one is not at the expense of the
exactly. They're both coexisting. With the flame is a regular flame. For some reason, though, the tree isn't being
It just
consumed.
continues to renew. It doesn't expend.
It's they're both living side by side simultaneously. And that vision sort of realigned Moses' perspective, eventually became that leader, the Jewish people, and he led them back to that mountain at Sinai, which the Jews all had that same experience. When God's presence came down to the mountain, and they literally were able to see an embodiment with the clouds of the spiritual presence of God. And that it was exactly the experience they had that set up the path for the future of Judaism, which is what we live today. And that's we have that same struggle sometimes. Do I take care of myself, my own spiritual growth? Do I help other people? Should I be prioritizing things that feel more meaningful to me, or things that I'm called on to do that may be annoying, but I know it's the right thing? And the entire sort of all the mitzvahs, all of Judaism is about integrating our own sort of spiritual pursuits with very practical applications. Every mitzvah we do, I put on tefillin. Is it meaningful? Yes. I mean, I'm embodying a very spiritual practice in a very material, detailed way. It has to be a certain way, a certain shape and color. And every mitzvah I do, Shabbat, I'll rest in my own way. No, there's a very specific way of resting in a very practical way, but it's also an embodiment of a very spiritual practice. And the two go hand in hand. Helping someone, giving charity, is that sort of, I don't have time for this person, No. Giving that person a smile, sharing a word with a stranger on the street is not disconnecting from my own path. It is my way of doing it. And that was sort of, in this first vision that God was giving Moses, he wanted to make it more than just telling him something. He was giving a visualization of what his mission is. Your mission isn't just to free a people from the clutches of slavery and oppression. You are creating a Jewish nation. And this has all been a crucible where the Jews have been in Egypt preparing for something much bigger. And I'm sending you in this mission to create that reality. And the burning bush was an embodiment of that new path that was being set out for the Jewish people and for the world, where the two can meet. And that's our mission. And that's the sort of the Messianic era. Mashiach is when we'll be fully realized. We're living in this world, and with our own physical eyes, we'll be able to see within the world the deepest spiritual things around us. We don't need to escape the world to experience it, but we want to either be trapped down in the very clutches of materialism. And marrying those two is what we're here for. That's what we do. So that vision of Moses was giving him that perspective and setting up the agenda for the Exodus and what was coming after that. Any questions?
I have two things, but I wanted to see if anybody else wants to say something.
Sure.
Go for it. Did how come Miriam didn't say to Moses, I saw that you are like the chosen person to lead us out of Egypt? Because she kind of already did see it, no? Like to help God, basically convince Moses.
Oh, because she in
Yeah,
the
it
beginning she says she recognizes that. Is that the commentary though, or was that in the text?
No, I'm
Commentary.
just asking in general, because she was part of the people that was led out of Egypt.
Right. No. That concept that she recognized him as someone who was going to be a savior.
Oh,
I don't think.
I didn't see that in here. I honestly, I have a kid's book that's like very simple, and it says it in the kid's book how she already knew that Moses was like that her mother was gonna have like, a special child.
He knew that she thought that.
That's in
because of
Midrash.
the fact that she
Yeah.
saved
I'm trying to think it brings it
him.
here.
Maybe he
I
knew
think
she
it's in
thought
there.
that about him because of the fact that she saved him, like the ultimate form of like
Yeah.
love for another is like saving him from like the blood, the slaughter that they were doing to all the infants.
And then I have another really stupid question. I don't know if there's any
No
connection
question is
to that.
stupid.
When we light Shabbat candles, Hanukkah candles, anything like that, we're not allowed to blow out the candles. Is that a connection with God because he appeared in the form of fire, and like you cannot put out that fire kind of thing. Is there a connection
Interesting.
somehow?
Interesting connection. Now there is. Generally, it's assumed that also there's a metaphor for the soul is a candle.
Okay.
The verse in Proverbs says, "Ner Hashem nishmat adam." The candle of God is the soul of a person, and so blowing out a candle seems to be like almost extinguishing a soul. So we don't blow it out; we wave it out. I don't know. I haven't fully understood this. To be honest, what the difference is blowing, waving out, but we don't blow it out. But in general, fire is a metaphor for God, for the soul, for anything really spiritual, because it's almost this strange element in our world,
Yes.
which doesn't really abide by the properties of matter, and therefore it's a metaphor, and it is something a little more spiritual, gives an indication of what spirituality is, something a little less tangible. Thank you all very much.